Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Calvin, We the Species, chronologically, March 29th. And I'm with Dr. Michael Hoffman from Cornell University. And we have so much. Right away, Michael wrote our changing menu. This has blown my mind as I plunge through this. I initially want to thank Alan Hesse from Ecuador, who kind of put us together as a matchmaker. Alan is very involved climatologically and with kids and actually with food and Michael's journey. We're going to talk about all about that. We're going to talk about whipped cream and tea and olives and cocoa and rice and peaches and potatoes and cows and bugs and pests. There's so much to talk about. And I said to Michael before he went on air, my head is swimming because as I'm reading this, I'm taking voluminous amounts of notes until I had an aha that every sentence is a note. So I cannot write down every sentence. It's like, my goodness, I never realized this. My head is swimming with factoids. The government spends $4 billion. I'm just rambling, and we're going to get to Michael in 2 seconds. The government spends $4 billion a year on agricultural projects, research, call it whatever you want. And Americans spend $43 billion on playing video games. I pull that out, and that was like somebody hit me over the head with a mallet. So we have a lot to do to cover. By the way, my other thing I said to Michael also is that this should be standard reading for everybody over the age of 5, right up until 95 and beyond. Because it opens up your mind and to make you think and to make you to innervate you. This is such great stuff. Scary. And maybe you can alleviate some of the scariness, but it's scary. The IPCC the other day came out with another dire warning. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also scared the hell out of me. We're really running out of time. You can address that too, Michael. Anyway, I'm done with my slightly long. I had to do this. To set this up, to set you up. So I'm done. And I guess the best way to begin is a little bit of your journey to how you got where you are. Take it away, Michael. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Calvin. I'm very happy to be here and help spread the word, so to speak. A little background. Well, look, grew up in a little farm.
Background. You want to start from, the dairy farm where you grew up?
Yeah. Well, it's a qualified dairy farm. I guess when you have one cow, that's still a dairy farm. But that's where I grew up. Milk the cow in the morning, every night. That supplied milk to the house. My mom made butter. So it was a very special upbringing, close to the land. And that's will always remain with me. Standard thing, went on to, I should mention I had a couple of unique pets along the way. Elmer the goose, Yogi the pig, and Carl the crow. And if anybody wants a special pet, a crow is it, if that ever happens in your life. They're extremely smart, etc. And sometimes scary. But same, Midwestern kid, grew up. That was during the Vietnam War era. I quit college so I could serve in the Marines, went to Vietnam, came back, got married somewhere in there. Went on for multiple degrees, ended up with a Ph.D. in entomology from the University of California, Davis, and then came to Cornell in 1990 and spent 9 years as a full faculty member, but then went into leadership positions and of all sorts for 21 years. And now I'm Professor Emeritus, which means I get all the privileges of a full-time faculty member, but I don't get paid. That's okay. I work full-time on helping people understand climate change through food. Somewhere in there, I picked up on climate change, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. a dear friend of mine gave me a book, Revenge of Gaia, by James Lovelock, and that was sort of a tipping point for me. That was, he was ahead of his time, pushed a few buttons, but that brought the light. I saw the light of that climate change light. And again, all I did do now is dedicate my time to this very thing, just spreading the word about how climate change is essentially changing everything on the menu. You know, I'm not hearing, or I'm not telling you it's going to go away. It's not like doom and gloom, but it's changing and we need to pay attention. So there, here we are.
All right, here we are. Talk about our changing menu. Just a quick overview of how much climate change is really affected. I started off throwing tea, olives, cocoa. I mean, all the stuff is affected. So talk about your journey to writing this along with Carrie and Danielle, and take it from there.
Well, I've given many talks about climate change, and then over the years, sort of, they evolved into picking up more and more on food in that conversation with the audience, and you could immediately see a reaction in the audience when you said something about, yeah, coffee's in trouble or chocolate. And I thought, And then I kept seeing these people doing TED Talks, etc., and getting in the press, and they'd all written a book. So there was like a means by which we could better tell the story or get more attention by writing a book. So I reached out to Danielle, who is now on the faculty at Cornell, but she was a professional chef for 5 years. Wow. So it's pretty convenient to have a chef on board when you're writing a book about a dinner menu. And Carrie was a freelance writer for many years, and we had worked together. So she brought her expertise to that story, and we'll get to this, but specifically the interviews of people on the front lines around the world facing climate change. So as a team, we spent somewhere between a solid 3 years of research, because there's a lot of references there in the book. They don't get in the way of its readability, but the data are there to support everything we say, and it had to be correct, given the topic being climate change. So somewhere between 3 and 4 years from when the idea came to me and to reach out to them, we finally published it a little over a couple of years ago. And it's the whole concept of our changing menu is really catching on. Very pleased.
Interestingly, I read that surveys show that in the subject of climate change, when you bring out food and people's menu changing, they react more to that than anything else, correct?
Well, we did. I think you're referring to the national survey we did
yes.
A little less than a year ago. And the idea actually was to test whether people did care more about food. Well, let's put it this way. It was a messaging experiment. So about 500 people received a survey that started out with a paragraph on the standard description of the impacts of climate change: melting glaciers, more extreme weather. And then a set of 19 questions. Well, another 500 people got an opening paragraph that said climate change is going to affect your coffee and chocolate and so on. So it focused on food in the same 19 questions. So that the whole idea was, do people react more intensely in response to these questions when it's food or the standard message? And it turned out we didn't see it at sort of at that level. But then you start looking at the questions, and one of them was, do you really care about climate change impacts on food choices? Absolutely. And what actually quite exciting about the response is it crossed political lines. Everybody eats.
Aha.
Everybody eats.
Aha.
Another question: do you want to learn more about climate change effects on your food? Same thing. Roughly 80%, I'll just say, Democrats and 60% Republicans said, yeah. Will you pay more for food that's grown using climate-friendly practices? Same thing. Then we embedded one of these standard questions: do you consider climate change a crisis? Well, Democrats about 60% and Republicans 20%. But compare that when you're asking a question about food. So, do we have a window of opportunity here to work across that divide using food? Everybody eats. It's all changing. So that story, there's an opening there that we have to take advantage of. So it's pretty exciting. And basically that proved the whole basis of we wrote a book assuming people cared, but we now know. And the survey had several more questions, but they're all pretty consistent.
Yeah. Fascinating. Really fascinating. Michael, a quick overview where food comes from. If you can compact that.
Well, there's a pretty simple answer to that. It's everywhere.
Everyone.
But let me just give some examples that most of us, I learned a lot. You learn a lot writing a book. Okay, it's a small percentage of our vanilla that we use. 1% is natural. Most of it comes from Madagascar. And every blossom has to be hand pollinated.
Wow. Hand pollinated.
Hand pollinated.
Wow.
Way back when, it turns out at that time, a young slave figured out how to do it. And from then on, the industry took off. And just to throw in a little climate change, Madagascar has been hit a number of times with hurricanes, which actually devastate vanilla plants, trees. And the price of vanilla a couple of years went up 350% a couple of years ago.
Wow.
So that's one. Let's see. Well, when I go to the store, I love blueberries. They're healthy, refreshing, and so on. But I also look at labels. Where's this from? That's another thing to do in a grocery store. Well, for us, upstate New York, this time of the year, they're coming from somewhere else, and oftentimes from Peru. Okay. Well, in fact, the U.S. imports about $5 billion of agricultural products every year from Peru, but a lot of that is dependent on irrigation water from meltwaters off the ice cap. The ice cap's going to be gone completely in 20 years. So it's not only where it comes from, but you got to think like what's happening from where it's coming from. Chocolate, another favorite, comes from Western Africa. Conditions are changing there. The other part of where it comes from is there's somebody there picking that blueberry. There's somebody there picking the cacao for us. So there's people. Maybe one other example would be, a lot of people appreciate grass-fed beef. In reality, most is imported, and a lot of it from Australia. Again, there's an Australian farmer down there raising cattle that end up here as grass-fed beef. So there's 2 points there. In a sense, it comes from everywhere. And don't forget that farmer or rancher that's, living off the land, being a steward of the land, and trying and making sure we've got food on the menu. Not just for the U.S., to add one last point, we produce about 80% of the food we need and only import about 20%. But that 20% consists of a lot of fruit and vegetables.
Mm-hmm. I also read, and I wasn't aware of that, but 98% of the farming business here is independently owned.
Family owned.
Family owned.
Yep, family operated. 98% of our farms.
Wow.
Yeah, we oftentimes just think of corporate farms, but that's not actually quite correct. I mean, some of those family farms could be incorporated, but it's still incorporated, but it's still a family. Which
is amazing. It's amazing. There's another challenge. It's not necessarily our changing menu, but the whole structure of how we get the transportation of food also is stressed out.
Yeah, I mean, somehow that vanilla from Madagascar has got to get here, the cacao or rice or cashews from Vietnam. But we often forget that, well, for example, until recently, the Mississippi River was in a severe drought. And that would have been last fall. And that's a time when the Midwest is harvesting grains for export, like somewhere between 70 and 90 million tons that normally goes out by barge on the Mississippi. Well, the barges were scraping bottom. It didn't work, so they had to truck it, find other means, which raises the price, etc. That's a huge amount of food that couldn't, it did ultimately, but was, having a challenge to get it out to the rest of the world. Same with the Panama Canal, drought there has dropped the water level so big ships can't get through. There's some other issues too. In the US, there's something like 60,000 miles of road near oceans where it's at risk of sea surges, between storms. So we got a lot of challenges. It's okay.
We have a lot of challenges.
Be aware of this,
We have a lot of challenges. I've been so conscious about this. When we spoke last week, on April 22nd, 1970 was my slap in the face. The first Earth Day. And I woke up and I've never been the same. I don't eat four-legged animals, which is good. I'm not completely plant-based, but it's the awareness, and that's what we're trying to do. You're trying to do with our changing menu, to make people aware, to make people think. And maybe if there's enough voices, and you wrote that, if there's enough voices out there that'll tip that scale and get some more red people involved and get more blue people involved. This is just so powerful. I can't show it enough. So in reading this, there are things happening to our plants which we don't. The soil, the soil, the temperatures, the nutritional quality of things coming out, all that is changing. Correct?
And it's fascinating. So let's just take a plant. Most of us that kill plants, house plants, and you put them next to the heat register or something, or you forget the water, you go on vacation. They need a crop plant, and all plants need air, specifically carbon dioxide, water, the right temperature, soil, and sunlight. The only one that's not changing on that list is sunlight. Everything else is changing for a plant. So let's just go down the list. If we think about the air, so we've put a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In fact, it's up about 50% higher than it should be. So you will hear the argument that that's good for agriculture because, in fact, it has sort of a fertilization effect on plants. They already need it, so you give it more, they're going to, in fact, grow faster. Yields are higher. But the consensus is that's right, but extreme weather is going to offset any gain from increasing CO2 on yields and growth and so on. But CO2 also will make some weeds harder to control with herbicides. These studies have been done. Insects like to eat more when plants are growing under higher carbon dioxide levels. They're not quite 100% sure why, but they actually do more damage. So you got to field the soybeans or whatever, it's going to experience more insect damage. The one theory that most people think of is just simply that plants are growing faster. So it's the nutrients are diluted, so the insect has to eat more. Pretty simple. But then the big one is studies have shown that B vitamins in rice will decline by mid-century with increasing CO2. Now that's, there's a few billion people around the world that depend on rice. Some of our other staple crops like wheat, essential minerals will decline, proteins decline. Now that's one side of the story, but we also have plant breeders who hopefully can keep up with that decline and breeding better, more resilient and more nutritious crops. But it's a big deal because that's worldwide. So that's how the air is changing. Another one would be the temperature. Well, we all know it's getting warmer. whatever, 1.1 degree C, the atmosphere warmed up. But it's not that simple. Here again, I'll use the example of increasing nighttime temperatures reduce yields in rice. It's the physiology of the plant such that it actually, the warmer nights mean lower yields in rice. But then let's look at almost all fruit trees and all nut trees require a winter dormancy period. They have to go dormant or they don't bear fruit. So in 2017, Georgia, the peach state in the US, production was off 85% because the previous winter was too warm. The trees didn't go into that dormant state.
Wow.
Pistachio growers, same thing. The trees did not go in that dormant state because the previous winter was warm. So that season, yields were way off. They lost like in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Wow.
So that's, you know, on the nights, the winters are going to continue to warm. In fact, in the US, winters are warming about twice as fast as summers. Where rain falls or precipitation falls, how it falls, when it falls, and what form it falls is all changing too. We're seeing that sort of an extreme in these atmospheric rivers that are hitting California.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are natural. They always happen. And that's how California gets its precipitation generally this time of the year. But because the air is warmer, the atmosphere is warmer, it holds more moisture. And because the ocean is warmer, the storms pick up more moisture and then they hit the coast and it gets dumped. So that's one example of changes in precipitation. And one of the really strange one is hail will get larger. Because you've got that little ice crystal that starts the form of the hail. There's more turbulence, more energy in the atmosphere. It just throws that little ice crystal up multiple times, and each time it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then finally it falls. So some areas of the world hail is going to increase. So it's like we say over and over, everything is changing, and soil, you know, had a great conversation with someone yesterday, and it's nothing new, but we both agreed, you know, soil is potentially the answer to climate change. It has a carbon deficit because it's lost a lot of carbon. So can we refill, you know, address that deficit and get soil to capture carbon from the atmosphere being an enormous help. The other thing about soil, and you take a handful of healthy soil and there's like 5 billion bacteria in that handful. Right. It's a living organism. You know, next time you step on it, maybe show a little respect. I mean, it's really, it's the skin of the earth, and we have to treat it appropriately. And a lot of times we don't. So, yeah, endless stories.
Endless. So we have soil on one hand, and then we have the oceans, and I've read, I know it's becoming way more acidic, bad for coral, bad for a lot of things. The phytoplankton, we've got I don't understand, but what the significance is, but there's a 5,000-mile long bunch of phytoplankton kelp heading towards Florida. So the ocean's a mess. We talked about it last week. The amount of plastics in the ocean is beyond comprehension, and we're eating that. You know, we're eating microplastics. So talk a little bit about oceans and the food chain and the menu.
Well, you bring up food chain. So like on land, it all starts with plants. We eat plants, the animals we eat plants. So it all starts there. And in the ocean, they're called phytoplankton. Little tiny plants that are floating in the ocean. They don't get too in the upper layers of the ocean. And by the way, they produce like plants on land, but those phytoplankton in the oceans produce half the oxygen we need to live on. What's happening there is they get nutrients from upwelling water from the deep, and that's how they get their supply of what they need to eat or consume. But because of warming, the oceans are becoming stratified, so you're getting more of a layer effect, and the nutrients aren't coming up. So there's one report in the Indian Ocean where, phytoplankton declined about 20%. And I'm sure there's something more recently I just read, there's something else about zooplankton also having problems the same way. But basically what's happening is the basis of the food chain. So the phytoplankton are eaten by a little bit of, bigger creatures, a little fish comes along and a bigger fish, etc., and ultimately the fish that we consume. But what's happening is that basis of the food chain is being compromised. So that's one example. The acidification, because the oceans are absorbing a lot of the the carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere, becoming acidic, and that affects the creatures that typically have shells. The shell doesn't form or forms poorly. You think of clams and scallops, etc., are being compromised. Several years ago, I think I will get this right, but I believe it was the oyster industry in the northwest coast, along the coast, where they grew the young oysters and then planted them in the ocean, so to speak. Well, everything died. And the water in the tanks was direct from the ocean. And that was bingo. So they could control the acidity in those tanks and then things were okay. But it was a real good example of what can happen. Temperature changes. I think most people have heard about sort of the lobster populations moving north along the northeast coast. It kind of makes it kind of tough on someone who is a lobsterman. And all of a sudden, the lobsters are 50, 70 miles away. So what actually happened is sort of at the interface where this higher, where the cool water and warm water are meeting much further north, the lobster population just exploded. So they had plenty of lobster. They were just in the wrong place for those who couldn't, take their boats up 50 miles every day. So some of those fishers, as we call them, switched to other seafood just to stay in business. And the trouble with the oceans, they're just vast. It's not like we can just say, okay, let's do this or that and we'll change everything. But really, they're vast, and add to this overfishing and so on. A lot of challenges in the ocean. But the big one is we have to address climate change or our emissions. That's what's changing the oceans.
A quick overview about our changing menu, starting with a quick overview, starting with, before you have dinner, you have a glass of wine or a drink.
Sure.
Starting with a drink, and then you have a salad that's changing. Then your main course changing, dessert changing. So a quick overview of our changing menu. In other words, I would love you to symbolically slap some faces out there. Be mindful of one of my favorite movies, Moonstruck, when Cher slaps Nicolas Cage and says, "Snap out of it." So you need to get people to snap out of it and start processing that we've got a changing menu.
Well, so here's a whack in the head about Scotch. A lot of people like Scotch, which comes from Scotland. And, they've got tens of thousands of barrels of Scotch aging essentially out of doors now. There are those kind of out of door conditions. And they currently lose about 29 million gallons of Scotch a year because of evaporation through the oak.
Well,
that's always been happening.
Always.
Well, yeah. And way back when they didn't really understand how that was happening, they called it the angel's share. This is such a good product. It's okay if the angels want a little bit of it. But 29 million gallons now, well, guess what? It's warming. That's going to increase.
So that's going to increase the
more Scotch
right.
Will be evaporated out and lost every year.
Wow.
Wine grapes are sensitive to high temperatures, so they may have higher sugar content, the acidity changes, aroma changes in the grape itself, which obviously affects the wine. So looking forward just to wine, they'll be different in the future. We may still be enjoying wines, but they won't be the same as today. And also with wine, what's happening? Well, vineyards in part are moving north to stay in the cooler climes, especially in Europe. I mean, the UK is now, bragging about they will be the new wine center of Europe someday. A number of things and also bottom line, those industries, distilled spirits, wine, and beer are water intensive. Now we're getting too much water or not enough water. It affects them in so many ways. Salads. Because the winters are warming, salad production may actually expand. There'll be more places, regions where you'll be able to grow lettuce and other greens in the future. Tomatoes, presumably are going to get sweeter based on the science. Onions a little more pungent. If you like that, it might be a good thing. What else? Olive oil, that most of which comes from Spain. Under stress there because of higher temperatures and drought. Oh, and avocados, which we love. I've forgotten how many tons of guacamole we consume on Super Bowl day, but it's a lot. They're going to be struggling in California because of higher temperatures coming years. So then let's move on to the main course. So let's think of poultry, fish, and meat. So you hear a lot about consumption of red meat in particular because it comes from a ruminant animal that emits burps, methane, and uses a lot of land. But here's a surprise. One, a lot of people don't realize that those animals are actually on grassland for a good part, most of their life. We all quickly envision feedlots. Well, that's where they end up to be fattened up to meet consumer demand. But our approach to consumption of red meat, and I can't be a hypocrite because I will occasionally have some, is to treat it as a delicacy, not a staple. Most people react to that, well, okay. So we already talked about seafood, but better get used to enjoying, if you do, squid and octopus, because as the oceans warm, they will become more common. It's already happening. And since some of our other favorite fish are in decline, they may be more popular on the menu, more common. And fowl or chickens and turkey in the US mostly are grown in indoor facilities. So, they can somewhat control both the weather, the temperatures, and so on. So they'll be okay. Although a hurricane or two hit in the southeast hit some of these huge poultry facilities years ago, which were pretty devastating to populations of birds. Sides, rice, I mentioned, decline in nutritional quality. Wheat, the same. Potatoes, it's my favorite food, mashed and with lots of butter. But let's see, one of the interesting, and by the way, they also yields decline for potatoes when nights warm up a little.
Right, they need a cooler nighttime.
Yep.
So that's going to be affected too.
Right. A couple of years ago, the chips in the UK, what we would call a French fry, were 1 inch shorter because that year was a drought and high temperature, so they didn't have a good crop. And finally, I don't want to talk about it, but you mentioned that earlier. I think coffee and dessert. The area which will be acceptable for production of coffee will decline substantially by mid-century. Chocolate, on the west coast of Africa. They're under stress. I think I mentioned that earlier. But here again, I'm going to insert the fact that there's a group in Costa Rica and the UK of all places looking at better coffee varieties. You know, there are a lot of scientists out there, a lot of specialists working hard to sort of keep up to the changes, to keep some of those special things on the menu.
That's what my next question as we kind of wind down, is what can and what is science doing, farmers doing, creating more resilient crops, etc. So they're now motivated, science and farming, to isn't the whole answer though to the problems. It'll help.
Well, but I think it's a message we convey in the book that there is a lot going on. And so when you talk about farmers and ranchers, I refer to them as stewards of the land. I mean, they're caring for the land. You can be a good steward, you could be not so good steward, but that's what they do. There's a lot of emphasis on soil health. You know, again, the soil is just a remarkable, almost like an organism. And when it's healthy, so are the plants. A soil with lots of organic matter will absorb water. So when you get a rain and the soil has organic matter, a lot of it is absorbed. And then when you have a dry spell, that organic matter helps hold that water. So it's really important. But there's a lot of emphasis on soil health. Diversification is another one. So where you can grow multiple crops, a good idea in case 2 or 3 get wiped out by extreme weather, you still have an income. Efforts to adapt are important. We've got new pests coming in. You know, how can you do that in the manage those in the best way possible, taking advantage of, say, of natural enemies. So farmers are doing a lot. And I had a farmer, after I gave a lecture on this topic, he came up and he said, Mike, a lot of this is common sense. You know, this is the things we know we have to do. So they're working on the topic. The food industry, same thing. Well, first of all, looking at supply chains. So if they need a spice special or a bunch of spices from India, can they actually work with those farmers to make sure they have the tools they need to succeed so that that company has a raw product? Some of the major chocolate companies have invested substantially in cacao growers around the world. It's a good business decision, let alone it's good for those farmers. I recently heard a speaker from one of the major wine companies talking about lighter weight bottles.
Yeah.
You think, well, I think this is right, but I heard recently that when you buy a bottle of wine, 30% is wine and the rest is glass in weight. And you know, that kind of makes sense when you if the bottle's empty, it seems like it weighs about as much when it's full.
Right.
So that, you know, there are things like that. They're also looking at energy conservation in their facilities, working again with the producers that they depend on. We have a long ways to go, but you know, there's also associations that have come together that are striving as an industry to help address these issues. And you know, in part, it's hey, staying ahead of the competition,
right,
and surviving. And then finally, scientists. To me, this story about food and the risk it faces is a great opportunity to talk about the importance of science, to everything from helping farmers manage these pests to more resilient varieties, how to manage too much water, not enough water, etc. And then modeling, you know, what's going to happen 6 months from now, or, you know, better idea when the next storm is coming so you can do what you need to do on your farm to protect the crop. And also, I know people are anxious or get nervous about genetically engineered crops, but a lot of global reports indicate that as when it comes to consumption, they're just as safe as regular developed crops. Implementation, there are some issues, there have been issues that we know about, but when it comes to consumption, they're okay. And the new technology that's called gene editing is, and I use sort of the example of think of a piano keyboard with 32,000 keys, and you take one key off. Well, you look at the genome, the collection of genes in a corn plant, there happens to be 32,000 of them, 32,000, and you take one away. Well, it's very precise. Still have to, like all kinds of things, monitor it, but so, you know, taken together, we've got help out there coming from farmers, the industry, and science, but we also face an extraordinary challenge, so we've got to keep at it.
Okay, so your part, we discussed this, you're part of like a great awakening, and that's what this is all about. And again, people really need to read this to awaken, to become much more proactive. You need more voices to jump into all this. It's like a balance. When I guess we get more than 50% of people really realizing that this is our menu is changing. We're talking about food, so you are part of the great awakening. As your dream is to become the place to go for food, and this will help guide people and make people think. So you got science. So it's all not my last little question. So it's all not doom and gloom. We've got work. We've got work to do and science. So I saw somewhere. I get all these things sent to me that there's a future $1 trillion business of extracting, and this is off topic, but extracting carbon dioxide from the air to cool things down. And when we get going on that, there'll be $1 trillion business. Is that something, is that too science fiction, or is that something we might be able to do?
Well, I think even in the IPCC report that just came out, they basically say at some point we're going to need that technology
to do that.
Yeah, and I don't know what the $1 trillion, et cetera, but current technology, as I understand it, it's still very expensive. And bear in mind, you can't use energy, you know, like fossil fuels to run these systems. It has to be solar or wind or something.
Right.
But maybe I'll mention, you know, you look at this great challenge, and yes, the idea is to use food to raise our voices, to use the common ground of food across consumer groups, farmers, chefs, you name it. And we all tell the same story. I think it could be transformative. And that's the point. But also, just to remind us all, look at what we as a species have accomplished on this planet. Think of the art.
Yeah.
Medicine. You know, some diseases have been cured. They don't exist anymore. Engineering, technology, etc. And yeah, we grow, at least in parts of the world, all the food we need. So what's missing? The will. The will. We have to decide this is what we want to do.
Okay. Well, Michael, this has been great, and this is great. And I really mean this sincerely. This is just wonderful reading. It just opens, it just makes you think. And it also makes you think, as I'm reading this, I gaze out into my kitchen and I see my little grandson sitting in one of those little things there, and realizing this is for him. And my granddaughter also out there, this is for them. It is for us. We love to eat, but this is such it's like a Bible, a survival Bible. So I can't thank enough for your time, your generosity, your graciousness, for being here. Cornell, as I was reading, is an amazing agricultural and life science school. Amazing. It's been around for so long, just an amazing place. I was up there once. Long story, but anyway, thank you. And we said this before, come back to panels, however I can help. I'm on your team and we're contemporaries. We discussed that too last week. You took a little different direction than me, but we're contemporaries. Please come back. And again, thank you. And thank you for this.